Committee will come to order. This week, the committee will hold two hearings that focus on the two major pillars of our agenda. Tomorrow, we'll hear from the service chiefs on repairing and rebuilding our military. Today, however, we'll concentrate on the other pillar, which is defense reform. We've done a lot of reform over the past 2 years. That includes acquisition reform, a new military retirement system, major changes in military health care, commissary reform, a rewrite of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, as well as significant organizational reform. While a lot has been done, however, a lot more needs to be done. The world around us is simply moving too fast for us to sit still and assume that the organizations and processes of the past will suffice for today and especially for tomorrow. Yes, we all have an obligation to see that taxpayer dollars are spent as efficiently and as effectively as possible, especially in fulfilling the first job of the federal government, which is to defend the country. But we all know from the news and from our intelligence briefings that we face a wide, diverse array of threats, and those threats change day by day as adversaries develop systems designed to deny us any military advantage. We must be prepared for each of these threats. We also know that the pace of technological change is accelerating and that more and more innovation takes place in the private sector. All of these trends stress our existing organizations and processes. We will not be able to defend the country with outdated technology or sluggish bureaucracy. Much of the responsibility for making needed reforms rests with us, with Congress. We cannot do everything in a single bill or even in 3 years, but we must be willing to move aggressively to make the reforms needed in this volatile, dangerous world. There are no individuals who can provide wiser, more considered guidance than the three witnesses we have today, each of whom has held high office in the Department of Defense, each of whom has testified many times before this committee, and each of whom have devoted their careers to helping provide for the national security of the United States. I appreciate each of them being with us today. Before turning to those witnesses, let me yield to the distinguished acting ranking member, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our witnesses here today and proud to be able to speak on behalf of Ranking Member Smith this morning, and I'll be submitting his statement for the record after I read it, but thank you again to our witnesses. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on this topic of critical importance. And again, I also want to say thank you to our witnesses for sharing their opinions on past and future defense reform opportunities. I know you all have a wealth of knowledge, and I appreciate you sharing this with the committee. I look forward to hearing the views on what the Department of Defense should or should not address in the future as it relates to acquisition policy, organizational structure, and military personnel reform efforts. The FY16 and FY17 National Defense Authorization Acts included significant changes to the acquisition division of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. First, decision-making authority for large acquisition programs moved from the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics to the Service Secretaries, and second, that the same Undersecretary position was split into two Undersecretary positions. This shift has created an unknown dynamic for the Department of Defense and private sector companies who produce goods and provide services for DoD. So here we are in 2017, working on next year's NDAA, and key acquisition positions are yet to be filled, and it's too early to tell if these reforms will prove to be successful. In my view, before we make additional acquisition reforms, we should see if last year's changes are effective, because frankly it seems as if current changes may be overwhelming the system. The Department of Defense can only absorb so much new acquisition reform legislation. However, one area where DoD does not need congressional support is in helping it to right-size its infrastructure by authorizing a new round of base realignment and closure. DoD has been asking Congress to authorize a new BRAC round each year for the past 5 years, and they estimate a new BRAC can help save $2 billion a year. At a time of constrained resources, we cannot afford to waste $2 billion a year holding on to infrastructure that is in excess to the military's requirement. While some may question the force structure levels or raise concerns with the 2005 round, I believe Congress can and should work with DoD to address these issues and authorize a new round of BRAC this year. I'm also interested in where the Department and the services will go with personnel reforms. The FY16 NDAA reformed the military retirement system to provide 83% of the force a strong portable retirement plan that they can take with them when they complete their service obligation, but do not reach a 20-year retirement. It's time that the personnel system complements the retirement system with more flexibility and ability to target certain skill sets when needed. The services have been discussing for years the need for a more flexible personnel system, but have done little with the existing authorities they have to make any meaningful changes. People join the military and depart the military for a variety of reasons, and the system cannot be one size fits all. I understand, due to the nature of the missions and organizations, there are requirements and standards that need to be maintained. I'm interested in exploring concrete options that create flexibility to attract the qualified individuals' needs to fit the requirements, and as those requirements change, retain the quality the military needs to maintain high standards. With that, I thank the ranking member for letting me read his statement on his behalf, and I yield back to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Let me again welcome each of our witnesses: Dr. John Hamre, Chief Executive Officer and President for the Center for Strategic and International Studies; Michele Flournoy, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder, Center for a New American Security; and Dr. Dov Zakheim, Senior Advisor for the CSIS. As I mentioned, each of them have held high position in the Department of Defense, and we're grateful for y'all being here. Without objection, your full written statement will be made part of the record, but at this point, we'd be pleased to hear any oral comments you'd like to make. Dr. Hamre?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, it's a real privilege to be invited back, and I want to say thank you to you, not just for inviting us, but for this committee taking so seriously this important work of defense reorganization reform. This is not the kind of thing that most committees are doing these days. I'm so proud that you are, and thank you for that. I was on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee when
Excuse me, Dr. Hamre, would you get that microphone right up to your mouth?
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Thank you.
I was on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee when we passed Goldwater-Nichols and then the Packard Commission reforms. We worked on that very hard, but we made some serious mistakes with the Packard Commission reform, and we didn't understand it at the time. But when we took the chief of staff of the services out of the chain of command for acquisition, that was a mistake. You fixed that 2 years ago, and I'm very grateful for that. We made a mistake by decapitating the ecosystem for innovation in the department when we created the Undersecretary for Acquisition, made it the third most important position in the building, and we diminished the role of the Defense Research and Engineering. That was a mistake at the time. You fixed that last year. But I know that you're working on legislation this year. I haven't seen what you're proposing. So what I really am here to talk about is what happened last year. You did the right thing by elevating the research and engineering function. But unfortunately, in the conference, I think you undermined the impact of this when you created the second Undersecretary for Acquisition. The purpose of your goal last year, and we had conversations with the committee, was to make the Innovation Secretary the third most important position in the building. And that was the right thing to do. You did that. But by introducing a second Undersecretary who takes care of acquisition, that's where the money is. And I was the comptroller, so I know what it's like in the building. The guy that controls the money's got more clout. So your desire to elevate in prominence the innovation ecosystem in the department so that we become more dynamic in addressing new technology and new threats was unfortunately undermined when you created this second Undersecretary. And I would ask you to go back and take a look at that. You know, you did the right thing by delaying implementation 1 year. So you have a chance to really get this right. We need to recruit the biggest person we possibly can to come into that job. We have to recruit a very prominent person. They're not going to come in if the job looks like it's undermined by the structure of the rest of the senior leadership. So I would plead with you to take another look at that, and I'd be happy to come up and talk at any time. The other thing I would wish to talk to you about is you put in the Authorization Act last year, you created the Chief Management Officer. It's, as written now, it doesn't really do anything new. It carves out all the functions that are currently with the Deputy Secretary as the Chief Management Officer into that new position as an Undersecretary. I think there's a great promise in what you're looking at, but I think we need to make clear the way it's written in last year's bill, it's a staff function. What I think we need in the department is a line manager over the defense agencies. We do not have a line manager over the defense agencies. We have line manager for the Army, for the Air Force, for the Navy and Marine Corps. We don't for the defense agencies. I would ask you to consider looking at making that Chief Management Officer position, which you created, not a staff function, but a line function. Give it responsibility to manage, oversee, hire, fire, promote, to make capital investments, et cetera, for this very important function, to oversee the defense agencies. It's about $130 billion. So there's a lot of work to be done here, but you're not going to get management out of the job the way you wrote it last year. So I apologize for being blunt here, but you absolutely are on the right track. I think some minor adjustments, you will carry this across the line. And of course, I would be very flattered to work with you on anything this year. I haven't seen your draft bill, but I look forward to working with you in the committee, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Flournoy?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, truly an honor to be here to testify before you on such a critical topic as defense reform. It's hard to remember a time when the need for defense reform was more acute, given the incredible challenges that our military is likely to face in the future. We have a military that's more capable than ever before, but also it's a military that's on an unsustainable cost curve. And so fundamental reforms are needed to actually free up resources that can be reinvested in the critical concepts and capabilities and operations that will enable us to really maintain our technological edge in the future in a far more challenging security environment. So now is the time to continue with a plan for robust reform that ensures that we get the most possible out of every taxpayer dollar invested. And I, too, want to applaud the work that this committee has done in leading the charge on defense reform, particularly in the acquisition area. But what I wanted to do this morning is suggest 4 new areas that you may want to go deeper in this legislative cycle and in the future. The first is right-sizing DoD headquarters and, in particular, transforming the defense agencies. If you look today at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, the Combatant Command Headquarters, and the defense agencies, they total about 240,000 people, excluding contractors. That's about 20% of the defense budget. The substantial growth in DoD headquarters is not just a matter of inefficiency, but also one of effectiveness. In the private sector, bloated headquarters staffs have been documented to slow decision-making, push too many decisions too far up in the organization, incentivize risk-averse behavior, undermine organizational performance, and compromise agility. And I think the same can be true in government. Perhaps the greatest opportunity for potential savings lies with the largest defense agencies, which account for about $134 billion of the DoD budget. So highest priority in my mind should be given to those large agencies that operate most like civilian businesses, including DLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, DHA, the Defense Health Agency, and DFAS, which is the Finance and Accounting Service. And what I would encourage you to do is to require the Secretary of Defense to undertake a comprehensive management assessment of these agencies, looking at where best business practices, new technologies, and automation might actually improve performance and reduce cost, and create savings that could be reinvested in higher priority areas. Beyond this focus on defense agencies, I think it would also be a good thing for Congress to provide the Secretary with the flexibility and breathing room to assess across the DoD headquarters areas of potential overlap and look for opportunities to restructure, consolidate, reassign personnel, eliminate unnecessary offices and functions. And just hearing John's proposal for giving the CMO line responsibility over the agencies, I think that's very much worthy of consideration. Second key area I'd love for you to grapple with is BRAC. The department desperately needs a BRAC round. The estimate is that 22% of current infrastructure is excess to military need. The service chiefs have repeatedly testified that that infrastructure overhang is taking money away from readiness and from modernization and critical future warfighting capabilities. Based on past experience, the department is estimating that at least $2 billion a year could be saved. And although concerns about potential job loss are understandable, there are also a number of studies of past closures that concluded that most jobs are ultimately replaced and most affected communities actually do recover quite well. I think in a year where the Congress is also considering a major infrastructure investment bill, you could imagine directing some of that investment to affected communities and potentially easing their transition and mitigating some of the job losses associated with BRAC. So bottom line is every dollar we spend on unneeded infrastructure is a dollar that we're not using to support the men and women who serve in harm's way. So I would encourage you this year to act. The third area is reshaping and reinvigorating the civilian workforce. Today, DoD employs about 770,000 civilian employees, plus a comparable number of civilian contractors. Multiple efforts have been made to streamline the system with mixed success. I think you have an opportunity this year to provide the Secretary with a package of authorities to help reinvigorate the civilian workforce. I would encourage you, I list them in my testimony, I'll just briefly touch on some of them here, but requiring the Secretary to develop a comprehensive human capital strategy for how we recruit, develop, retain, and shape the civilian workforce, including in that assessing the optimal mix between military, civilian, and contractor workforces. Secondly, to set realistic personnel cost reduction targets over the FIDIP, to actually further modify the VSIP authority to allow it to be targeted on specific employees that are judged appropriate to leave government service, to encourage the Secretary to use the modified RIF authority that you provided last year but hasn't been used by the department yet, to give the Secretary flexibility to reallocate and reassign personnel as he right-sizes and reshapes the organization, and really to look at consolidating the personnel system. Currently, there are 66 different personnel systems that are being used for the civilian workforce in the Department of Defense today. 66. Imagine trying to manage that. Can we look at a consolidated approach under Title X that would really allow the Secretary to tailor one system to hire, manage, develop, compensate, retain DoD's civilian workforce? And there are a number of other ideas that I list there as well. The fourth area is improving the quality of health care while reducing costs. Today, the military health system costs have nearly doubled over the last decade, with the CBO estimating an additional $40 billion by 2030. What's even more important in my mind is that survey data suggests that the quality of care received by military personnel and their dependents remains uneven, and customer satisfaction is below civilian benchmarks in key areas. So I think this is an area where DoD and the Congress have an opportunity to explore ways of both improving the quality of care while also leveraging approaches like values-based health care to reduce costs. In my written testimony, I actually draw from an excellent report that Bob Hale, the former DoD comptroller, did for CNAS on reforming defense, and in particularly, he highlights 5 areas for healthcare reform that I think are worthy of looking at: wartime readiness, value-based reimbursement, utilization of services, productivity, and availability of choice. Let me just conclude by saying that I really do think we have a tremendous opportunity with this Secretary and this Congress to move forward on these issues. I think now is the time to provide the Secretary of Defense with the authorities and flexibility he needs to actually get better performance and free up resources for reinvestment in higher priority areas. But that said, defense reform, as you all know, is not a panacea. It's my hope that this Congress will also consider how to establish a more predictable and more robust levels of defense spending over the next 5 to 10 years without gutting diplomacy and development accounts that are also critical to our national security. I believe that reaching a comprehensive budget deal that includes all of the obvious elements, from tax reform to entitlement reform to smart investment in the drivers of our economic vitality and growth, it's not only an economic imperative, it's become a national security imperative. Lastly, I hope that through the dialogue that this committee is fostering, the Congress and the executive branch will be able to partner more closely together and make some of the hard choices and undertake the reforms necessary to ensure that we truly keep faith with the men and women who serve in the best fighting force in the world, as I think you'd all agree they deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Zakheim?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, Mr. Lungevin, and the committee. Like my colleagues here, I've been in front of this committee several times, and it's a real privilege to be here again and to testify yet again on defense reform. The last 2 years in particular, this committee has literally led the charge on implementing, first legislating, and then helping to, in effect, implement reforms that were sorely needed in the department. But as my colleagues have pointed out, and everyone here recognizes, there's still a way to go. I want to focus on some of the topics that have already been mentioned. The list is very long. Let me begin first with civilian personnel. I have a slightly different take than some of my colleagues have on what to do about the fact that civilian personnel has grown. It's 36% right now of all personnel in DoD. It's added, civilian personnel added 77,000 people over the last 15 years, an 11.5% jump. Military end strength, as we know, has gone down over that period by 8%. And civilian pay has gone up 31%. Most of that has gone to the general schedule, the white-collar folks. Wage board folks, the blue-collar folks, have barely gotten an increase at all. And I think that's worth noting. It's not at all clear that all these increases have actually provided DoD with more efficiencies. If it had, we wouldn't be talking about it today. And one of the serious issues involving efficiency is the degree to which civil servants offload too much work to contractors, and particularly to what are called euphemistically staff augmentees. We've got a problem with that because it creates a sort of unhealthy symbiosis where civilian workers essentially give contractors work that they probably could and should do themselves. And I had that when I was comptroller. I saw reports that were meant to go to the Congress that were poorly written. Turned out they weren't written by the civil servants. They were barely reviewed by the civil servants. They were written by contractors. And when I said this just wasn't the right thing to send up to the Hill, the answer was, okay, we'll send it back to the contractor. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. Another serious problem is the education of our civil servants. You can get a degree at the age of 25 and not take another course again for 40 years. That just doesn't work with Moore's Law, particularly with the acquisition core, but for human resource management as well. I think my colleagues are absolutely right. We need to focus on human resource management. If we don't train people, how are they going to know how to manage? We really need to ensure that anybody who wants to get particularly into the senior executive service should spend a year at a top-notch university, either doing business school type work or going to a top technology school, so that they really become educated consumers and educated managers. Without that, you're going to find people flailing around as they do today. It doesn't help. And the military system, whatever you think about the need to improve professional military education, at least they have it. And you cannot become a flag or general officer without going to the National War College or one of the service war colleges or the equivalent. We need that for our civilians as well. It's not fair to them. And last year's NDAA had some relationships established between the Defense Acquisition University and outside organizations, whether it's think tanks, universities, whatever. But the Defense Acquisition University is fundamentally a training institution. And if you go online and you look at the offerings, you'll see so many of them are distance learning. Well, distance learning has its points, but it's not really going to educate people in the way that face-to-face, year-long education will do. And it's as long as the course offerings are primarily for learning how to do something for training rather than education, you're not going to get what you need out of the DAU. The DAU has its place, but it's not the be-all and end-all. I would also argue that because the civilian personnel levels are just so high, we need to look at something like the Reduce Act. Unless you literally specify cuts, and it can be, and obviously the department will allocate those cuts, but unless you specify something along the lines of the Reduce Act, you're never going to get the civilian force levels down. And if you want to spend more money on the military force levels, you want to spend more money on procurement and acquisition, you've got to do something with the size of the civilian workforce. There's no two ways around it. And as for dealing with the staff augmentees, I would recommend that nobody who leaves the department as a civilian or a military person can go back to the department as a contractor for 5 years. In other words, you can't flip your badge and come back on Monday doing the same work you did on Friday. It just doesn't work out. It adds to the overload in terms of numbers of civilians. And obviously, if people have to stay out for 5 years, they're going to find other jobs, and you won't have this phenomenon of people literally doing the same job, just getting paid more and wearing a different badge. I'd also like to briefly talk about the reorganization of OSD. I don't feel as strongly as my colleague John Hamre does about the split of the two undersecretary into two undersecretaries. But one thing, we really need to make sure that their staffs don't grow so that, again, you're increasing headquarters instead of reducing them, as Michele would like to see, and I think we all would like to see. If you don't limit what they can add to themselves, one idea that I have had for many years is have the principal deputy double as the assistant secretary in some assistant secretaries, simply so that you don't have duplication of staffs. You don't need to have a principal deputy who has a staff of his or her own, in addition to the undersecretary, in addition to to the number of assistant secretaries. And by the way, I would recommend the committee look again at how many assistant secretaries the Defense Department really needs. In my testimony, I indicate some areas where some changes could be made there and reductions could be made. And finally, regarding the CMO, I totally agree with John. The CMO ought to be, in effect, the undersecretary, not with that term, but in effect, the undersecretary for the Fourth Estate. Have them focus, have the CMO focus on that area. We're talking about Fortune 500 companies that are managed by people who would not be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So we need to get somebody good in there. We need to get somebody with business experience in there. And that CMO should focus on that. Right now, the mandate is so broad that what's going to happen is there will be inefficient focus on any one area, plus lots and lots of turf wars. There is nobody who focuses only on the defense agencies and field activities. That's because the undersecretaries who have them in their org charts simply are focused primarily on other things. When I was comptroller, I suspect when John was comptroller, yes, we had DFAS, and yes, we had DCAA under us, but that was not our primary task. Our primary task was to focus on the budget. So I would strongly recommend, as I think John does, that the CMO focus on that fourth estate. And finally, on acquisition reform, because I know my time's running out, I would simply say this. I know that there's been some skepticism about DIUX and about, to some extent, the third offset. Frankly, I think the third offset is necessary. It only shouldn't be a replacement for force level increases, which to some extent was the implication that many people took away from when this third offset was first introduced. As for DIUX, it seems to me that they've overhauled their personnel. They are clearly focused on innovation, but if you want them to succeed, you've got to do some other things. In particular, the Defense Department needs to default not to FAR Part 15, which is the classic way of contracting, but either to FAR Part 12 or some other system where, in effect, you are buying directly from the contractor who doesn't have to be part of the defense base. If you do that, you are going to totally overhaul the culture of the department, which right now thinks profits is some kind of sin, which essentially wants to go through many hurdles and hoops before anything gets done, and that's where we get our delays, that's where we get our cost overruns, and that's where we get frustration on the part of your committee and Congress generally, and the consumers of defense, who are the taxpayers. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for allowing me to repeat many of the things I've said before, but the committee's doing a wonderful job, and just keep it up. Thank you.
Sometimes we need to hear it more than once, so that's okay. I want to go back and examine some of the specifics y'all have talked about at the end if other members don't ask about them. But let me just start with a couple big picture questions. Seems to me when it comes to defense reform, there are two major justifications. One is efficiency, squeeze more money out so it can be used for other purpose. The other is agility, so you can keep up with changing threats, changing technology, adaptive enemies, and so forth. Do each of you agree that the efficiency part, if everything were perfect and you could squeeze out all the inefficiency possible, do you believe that's enough money to rebuild the military, to repair the damage that CRs and sequestration have created over the past number of years?
Do you mean the budget as the slim budget that was proposed?
No, what members ask me is they'll see a headline and says, oh, greater efficiencies could save this much money. And the question is, can you reform your way to health if you're just looking at the dollars?
Yeah, my personal view is that you're going to need additional resources. You cannot find enough savings inside the department to compensate for the readiness issues we have now, the force structure issues we have now. I think you're going to need more money, personally. Now, that isn't to say you shouldn't dig in on getting rid of the inefficiencies. But I think we just need more money because the department is stretched.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to understand.
Go ahead.
I would agree that you can't, defense reform alone will not be enough to generate the investment we need in future capabilities to deal with a more daunting security environment. By the same token, I don't think we can afford to simply put more money into the defense budget without defense reform, both from an efficiency perspective, but also from the very important point you made about agility, that this is also about improving the organizational performance of the department, not just reducing cost.
Dr. Zakheim?
I would agree as well. I would use a business metaphor, if you will. If you cut your operating costs all the way down and you don't increase your revenues, you're out of business. And in a sense, this is the same thing. I mean, you can push efficiencies only so far, but if you don't increase your top line, you're going to be out of business. And agility, I think, is equally, if not more important, because the fact of the matter is we do rely primarily on our edge and high technology. And if we're not agile enough, we're going to lose that edge because so much of the technology is no longer DARPA's province or DOD's province. It's out there. And so agility is absolutely critical. We need both. And I think the direction the committee has taken, I think, does allow the department to achieve both if the department's willing to cooperate.
Well, and let me just pick up on that for my second question. On the agility side, I think you heard earlier the statement that we need to just give it a rest, let the reforms we've already instituted have a chance to get, because there is a cost to churn, to change, and I think we ought to be cognizant of that. But I guess what again, a big picture sense from y'all is as you see the threats evolving, do you believe we should kind of back off and let what we've already done give a chance to set in, or do you think we need to continue to move maybe even more aggressively at the kinds of reforms that each of you have laid out? Just again, this kind of bigger picture, is the churn worth it, given what's happening in the world?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would say move as aggressively as you can. And the reason I say that is twofold. First, churn doesn't necessarily lead to bad things. Secondly, if you essentially call a timeout, what you're going to do is allow the bureaucrats in the department to figure out a way to get around everything you've done. That has happened in the past. I've seen it when I was in the Weinberger Defense Department. I saw it in the Rumsfeld Defense Department. I saw it when Mr. Rumsfeld tried to do things and the bureaucracy figured out how to get around him, much less you all. No, I think it's critical that you keep on pushing.
Okay, Ms. Flournoy.
I would agree with that. I do think that a lot of the change is focused in the acquisition area, and I think the department probably needs some period of consolidation of actually, maybe with some of the tweaks that John Hamre described, but needs some time to actually be able to implement and fully comply with what you've already asked them to do in the acquisition domain. But beyond that, I think now is a time where you have an opportunity to move much more aggressively now in other areas, which are equally important to bringing both agility and efficiency.
Dr. Hamre?
And Mr. Chairman, I would argue that I think you should move actively, aggressively on reform, because the American public is questioning the value we're getting out of what we put into the Defense Department. That was the real challenge of that study that was done by the Defense Business Board last year. It came at a time when people were saying, do we need to give DOD more money or don't we need to give them more money? I happen to think we do, but I also think the American public is questioning whether they got it. I think you have to push on reform in order to convince them that you're being a good steward of these resources.
Okay, thank you all. That's very helpful. Mr. Langevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for your insightful testimony here today. So, modernization approaches in our major programs have traditionally taken years to execute. For example, Increment 3.1 on the F-22 began development in 2006, and the first upgrade wasn't delivered to the fleet until 2012. While this strategy has worked in the past, the commoditization of advanced computing power has rendered it unsustainable, especially when you look at Moore's Law. I mean, technology squaring every 18 months. So our adversaries are now accomplishing multiple upgrades during our weapon systems development and acquisition timeline. How do we transform the military-industrial policy complex to restore our advantage in the timeline it takes to field new technologies?
I think it's one of the principal challenges we face, and I think one of the things, there are certain platforms that are going to take very long lead times to create, but I think we want one of the things we want to do is have more modularity in the designs of those platforms so that you can plug and play new information technologies, new electronic warfare systems, new modular components, because it's those capabilities that are developing much more rapidly, and those areas where we want to be able to change out capabilities on a platform that may have to last 20, 30 years. But that's key. The other key part is being able to approach the acquisition of commercial technologies and their integration with a much more responsive, agile, quick-turn set of authorities. One of the things that this committee has done is pushed some of those other authorities, those new authorities, to the department. I think what's now lacking is the change of culture and behavior that Mr. Zakheim highlighted as needed in the acquisition workforce. We need to actually educate, train a cadre who really knows how to use those new authorities, who has more of an innovation mindset, who is most comfortable acquiring commercial technologies and bringing them in. And that's a very different skill set and mindset than what you need to manage a major traditional defense acquisition program over a 20-year timescale.
And the only thing I would add to what Michele Flournoy just said is it's necessary, if you're going to change the culture, to have the bureaucracy default to buying commercial as opposed to default to the system that we now have. The Defense Business Board, which I am on, and a task force that I also was on, recommended, as I mentioned, focusing on the portion of the FAR, Part 12, that essentially deals with commercial off-the-shelf procurement as opposed to the classic system. You can do that. You can do other things. What really is important is ensuring that the default mechanism for buying the modularity that Michele talked about is commercial. As long as that is not the default mechanism, A, you're not going to change the culture, and B, you're going to have the same problems you just spoke about, Mr. Landgren.
I just briefly add that you're right to highlight that when we build platforms, gosh, it takes a long time to do it. But we also have examples where we've done things quickly, and we've done them effectively. We put Hellfire on Predator. I mean, that was just done in months. I mean, we're able to do things very quickly, and we should be studying why do we have places where we do it well, and then why do we get bogged down in other things? And a lot of it revolves around the commitment of the leadership and how closely the leadership is supervising the bureaucracy. You know, if the boss wants to pull something through the system, it works, you know. So I think we need to probably go back and take a look. This is why you did the right thing when you put the chairman of the chiefs of staff back in the chain of command. That's how we're going to get more results. It's making people more accountable and giving them more flexibility and say, we're not satisfied with 12-year-long development programs. You're right to highlight it. Let's look at the examples where we've been successful, too.
If I could jump in a second time, you know, we have a rapid acquisition system now that was created to get around our acquisition system. So that's where you ought to start looking. And I think what you'll find is that the rapid system simply eliminates a lot of the checkoffs and reviews and passing of paper that otherwise would take place. But that's where you should look. When a department creates a system to get around its own system, you ought to scratch your head and say why.
Yeah. So on this, thank you for those answers. And still on the topic of acquiring advanced technologies more quickly and allow them to be adapted more quickly. So technological advantage and the innovation that drives it have been key foundations of strength for our armed services. Our technology sector, from major corporations to small businesses, are crucial to invigorating research, yet they have limited access to and participation in our defense industry. While the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, or DIUX, is an excellent initiative to change this paradigm, the contracts awarded through this mechanism accounted for less than 1/100% of DoD's research and procurement budgets in fiscal year 2016. So how do we reform our acquisition cycle to promote participation and access for both giants of Silicon Valley and the entrepreneurial small businesses that fuel our American tech industry.
And I think the primary task and opportunity of the new Undersecretary, I like to call it the Undersecretary for Innovation, but it's the Research, Development, Engineering Undersecretary, is to take that soda straw that is coming through places like DIUX or DARPA and so forth, and to make it a superhighway, to really perfect the department's leveraging of these other authorities to access commercial technologies, to have it be commonplace, to be prototyping a number of systems, and then choose which ones you're going to bring all the way into full acquisition, to be incentivizing real experimentation and concept development that goes along with how we're going to allow these new technologies to actually transform how we fight. And again, that's going to take a different organizational culture, a different set of incentives and rewards, a different kind of training for the civilian and military workforces that actually have that task. So I think that is, you've done the organizational change, but to make that effective, you really have to get into how are you going to create the incentives, the career paths, the training to make that new organization behave fundamentally differently than the traditional acquisition corps.
I would add a couple of other things. First, DIUX essentially develops prototypes. Then it goes into the system. Once it goes into the system, you've got all the problems that the system has and that we've talked about. So again, that's another reason for accelerating reform rather than sitting back and waiting, because otherwise you've just shot DIUX in the foot. It won't be able to do anything. Another area related to that is you can mil-spec everything to death. And if you start mil-speccing what DIUX has prototyped, you're going to have a problem again. And I've spoken to the head of DIUX about it, and he acknowledged that that was a serious issue because they don't mil-spec. That's the whole idea of what DIUX is doing. So you've got to take a close look at that. Third area is just keep the DIUX leadership there. If somebody comes in from industry and is there 18 months, that's not really very, very good. You're not going to get anything out of an innovation like DIUX unless you've got somebody there for 3 years who figures out how the system works, how to get around the roadblocks, and so on. You've heard about the training from Michele. I won't repeat that again, but one other thing. DIUX now has leaders who are reservists, many of them. And our whole reserve system doesn't really account enough for the people who are in the high-tech area in their civilian lives and then come in and they'll be sent to clean the bilge or something. And I am not kidding. So DIUX provides a vehicle for bringing in reserves who are doing really well in the high-tech area, for example, down in Austin. The guy who's down in Austin, who's running that Austin office, is a reserve who reports directly to the CEO of Apple. That's what you want.
May I humbly offer a suggestion? The President has nominated Mr. Patrick Shanahan to be the next Deputy Secretary of Defense. Pat has a long and very storied career as a very effective program manager in one of our aerospace companies. You don't have a formal role with confirmation, but you should have him come up to talk to you, either in a formal hearing or in an informal hearing, and ask him, say, we're going to be measuring you by how well you accelerate the efficiency of this system, and I want you to come back to us in 3 months with each of the chiefs of staff of the military departments to say, how are we going to do it? This is about leadership, and I think you have a golden opportunity because we've got a new leader who has a lot of experience in managing in industry. I think it's a great opportunity for you to take advantage of that.
Very good. Some great suggestions. I thank you all for your answers and your insights. And although I have other questions, and I like this idea of not being on the clock, I'm going to be respectful of other members' time, and I will yield back and perhaps submit these for the record. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Mr. Wilson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you each for being here today and your service to our country. Dr. Zakheim, in your own experience as Undersecretary of Defense, what was one defense reform that stands out as being particularly effective, and what lessons should be learned and taken from that reform to inform ongoing and future reform efforts?
That's a tough question. Remember,
Well,
I was there at
we need some good news. I'd like to hear it.
I was there at the beginning of the 2000s. One reform that clearly did make a difference, I thought, was the ability of DARPA essentially to go directly to the comptroller and get money. And I'll give you a concrete example of that. Ron Sega at the time was director of DARPA. We had gone into Afghanistan. We knew a lot of the bad guys were hiding in caves. He comes to me and he says, this is November of '01. He comes to me and he says, if you give me X amount of millions of dollars, I've got this weapon called a thermobaric weapon that will smoke all these people out of caves. And I will have it in the field for you by March. Gave him the money. That was that. It was in the field by March, and it smoked a lot of people out. So there are ways, and I think my colleagues have pointed it out, there are ways to cut through this red tape. That was one example.
Well, as a grateful dad of a son who served as an engineer in Afghanistan, thank you for what you did. Ms. Flournoy, if you recommend a shift in new issues, what criteria should the committee use to determine issues of focus for future defense reform efforts?
I guess I would encourage you to sort of plot them on two axes. One is sort of bang for the buck, biggest return on the effort, and second would be the heaviness of the political lift, and to focus first and foremost on the things that are most impactful in terms of both improving that organizational performance and agility on the one hand, and potentially reducing cost on the other, and that are also in the politically feasible square. That's where I would start. You know, I think one of the things that the dynamics that's taken hold sometimes is, you know, the Department of Defense will propose and Congress will say, well, we don't really like that agenda, and we go back and forth trading. I would love to see the executive branch and the Congress sit down and say, let's create a target for how much money we want to be able to move from, you know, to save and move into reinvestment, and let you all really determine or have the lead in determining of all the target-rich environment of all the possible reforms, what are the ones that you think make sense and that you think politically we can get a consensus on to move forward on. And I mean, because the truth is there are many more opportunities than we can possibly handle in 1 year, and I think the key is keeping momentum going. And so, you know, that's, I would say, bang for the buck and political feasibility.
And very constructive. Thank you very much. And Dr. Hamre, under the leadership of Chairman Mac Dornberry of this committee, reform efforts have largely been focused the past few years successfully on acquisition, military personnel, and structural reforms at the department. In your opinion, should the committee continue its focus on primary reform efforts in these areas in order to capitalize on progress that's been made to date, or shift to new issues? If you recommend shifting to new issues, what issues do you recommend?
Sir, I do think, first of all, you're going to have to monitor the reforms efforts that you've put in place, because the reforms of last year are unsettled. And you did the right thing by giving a year implementation period, but that means you're going to have to be on top of it for this year to make sure that they follow through. I do think you should look at additional things. And I have my own set of pet rock issues. For example, and I know this is something your staff is looking at, the question of materiality for audit standards in the department. There is no materiality standard for the auditors, so they chase 10 cents. They chase parking tickets. They chase, you know, who had the blue cheese dressing. You know, I mean, it's crazy without having a materiality standard. We're wasting a lot of money and we're bottling up the defense industry because we can't close out contracts. I mean, this is a very mechanical, very arcane, but stuff like that is really important. It drives a lot. I personally think we need to bring back A76, where we conducted objective competitions between public and private sector over contracting out activities. Half of the time the government wins, but the government redesigned it the way it did the business, and it saved money every time. I think there are a lot of things like that that we could be doing and I hope you tackle these. These are not the big, glamorous, exciting things, but they drive a lot of money in this department. And I'd be grateful. I'm happy to come up at any time and talk with you about some of it. There's no purple property book for the Department of Defense. Every bit of property is owned by one of the military services. There's no central management. We're the biggest renter of real estate for the federal government outside of the General Services Administration, but it's all decentralized. We get no value for scale in our system. There are so many things we could do like this, but we have to change the way we do our business.
Well, supporting an audit, thank you for what you're suggesting. Thank you.
Mr. Swazi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm new to this, but I'm a former mayor and a county executive of a large county with a $2.8 billion budget, and it was a 50-year-old government that kind of grew over time. There was no central listing of the properties that were owned. There were multiple different IT technologies in all the different departments. So when I hear you talk about 66 different, what did you say, HRs, personnel systems, and when you talk about no centralization of management, and I just visited Guantanamo yesterday, and it's a sprawling facility with a new building here and another one over there, and it's very typical to what I saw in my experience. Now, I always felt it was, the executive's branch is really the one that has to get their hands around this. They're the ones who have to drive the ball here, and the legislative body can sometimes be more of a hindrance by trying to pass an additional law like no standards for the audits, for example. So, I don't really care who had the blue cheese dressing. I want to know about the big things that are going on. So I have a couple different questions. Number one is, you suggested before, Ms. Flournoy, that if we should target a number as to how much we'd like to try and target in savings that should be used for reinvestment. So the first question is, what do you think that number should be? Just to order, I'm not going to hold you to it, but it's just an order of magnitude type of number that we should be targeting for savings and then reinvestment. Second question is, when I look at the overall budget of the Department of Defense, personnel is $138 billion, operation and maintenance is $250 billion, and procurement is $112 billion. So operation and maintenance is bigger than either personnel or procurement, and I don't hear anybody talking about operation and maintenance that much. So it seems like there's a lot of that could be a target-rich environment. And what do you think about that basic observation, just looking at the numbers? And that's what I'll leave it there for now. So I'm just going to ask all of you, what's your target number that we should be looking for set a goal for this is what we want to get as savings to reinvest back into the military? And second is, what about operation and maintenance?
Well, the Defense Business Board, as you may know, came up with a study, it's been referenced before, a couple of years ago, which pointed out a host of different efficiencies and argued that over 5 years you could save $125 billion. That's a lot.
That would be $25 billion a year.
$25 billion a year. I personally think that number is on the high side, and they actually had high, low, and middle. But it just does seem to me that somewhere between 15 and 20 billion is not out of the question. That's number one. On the
just 25 billion is less than 5% of the budget.
Yeah, that's correct. On the operations and maintenance, you're absolutely right. One of the issues that has been ongoing for years is real cost growth in operations and support. And part of the problem with that is that when you buy a new system, the focus is always on the upfront costs and not on how much it's going to cost you out there. In fact, very often, the people who produce the system say, well, you're going to save a ton of money in the future, but if you start discounting, you discover you're not saving all that much. In fact, you're going to wind up spending a lot more than you thought. And so you need to have somebody very senior who's responsible for the O&M side when they get into discussions about procurement. I remember at meetings of the acquisition board, the person who worried about sustainment and operations was not as senior as just about everybody else around the table. Well, you know what happens when that's the case. I think high-level focus on O&M will get to the goal that you're laying out.
Yeah, I don't have a magic number in mind, but I do believe that the sort of order of magnitude that the Defense Business Board study talked about is probably correct over time. The challenge is it's going to require some upfront investment, so your initial savings will be smaller, and it'll grow over time. For example, base realignment and closure. It costs money up front to close bases, and then you get the savings over time, but it's documented that in most cases you do get the savings. Similarly, for things like IT transformation and automation, DoD is going to have to invest to move to the cloud or to a secure cloud and to start treating software as a service rather than building proprietary systems. That's going to require upfront investment, but over time, potential for dramatic savings. So I think you want to think about it as ramping up over time. The other key thing is the incentives. And this, I watched Secretary Gates struggle with this on the efficiencies mission effort that he undertook. The first time he went out and sat down with all of the services and the components, he said, okay, we're going to aim for, 10 billion, I can't remember what the number was, X billion dollars of efficiencies. Next meeting, come back with your suggestions. Everybody came back the next meeting, really hard to find anything, just, really couldn't do it. So he said, well, how about if I told you could keep half of what you find? Oh, so next time people came back, unbelievable ideas, wonderful creative ideas, because each of the components knew that they could now keep half those savings and reinvest in their priority areas. So I think the incentive structure is as important as setting the target level.
Thank you.
Just to build on what Secretary Flournoy has said, it is about incentives. And, both Dr. Zakheim and I were comptrollers. The patron saint of all comptrollers is Judas Iscariot, so nobody's ever going to come and give you money. And so it sets up this very bad dynamic, within the department. But there's one very important dimension. If any dollar that a military department, any one of the service chiefs, saves in the out years of the FIDP, they get 100% of that. Mm-hmm. It's only when it comes into the budget year when we arm wrestle with them and take some from them and give them a little bit back and all that. Everything they save in the FIDP, the out years, is something they get to pocket and they can reinvest inside their own service. The most important review that the department does is the program review, which is run by CAPE. We've kind of let that fall apart, honestly. If we were to get back to where the program review becomes more prominent in how we manage the department, and the service chiefs know if they make hard choices now, in 2 and 3 years, they get 100% of that money. Yeah. So we can get the incentives right, but we don't have it right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very interested in this topic, if there's anything we can do further. Thank you.
Great. Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great testimony, great suggestions, and appreciate my colleagues' comments there. I wanted to hone in on Dr. Zakheim, the Defense Business Board, the report that you put out that you just referenced. And as you know, that kind of caused a big stir when that came out, $125 billion, and that's 25 a year. Current and former department leaders and others have expressed concerns that some of the savings came from private sector initiatives that may not be achievable in the public sector. So in your opinion, what are the differences between accomplishing successful reform in the public sector versus the private sector?
Well, let me start with unions. We have in the Defense Department unions that bitterly oppose any civilian personnel reform where you could save a bunch of money. You could save probably initially anywhere between $5 and $8 billion a year just through human resource management. Well, Mr. Rumsfeld tried it, and it blew up in his face thanks to the unions. Now, the law, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1979, actually has a provision where the president could exempt Defense Department employees from being unionized. Already CIA employees, military employees, others are indeed exempt. Now, once you exempt them, then you can start pursuing those sorts of reforms, and that's one key area. In fact, that's probably the richest area for immediate reform because that's money that you spend immediately each year. There obviously are differences beyond that between the commercial sector and the government sector. But nevertheless, if you actually look at the report, as it does scale, 125 billion is kind of mid-level. There's less than that and more than that as well as options. But the key is, what kind of efficiency, what percent efficiencies could you realize? And if you took half the percent of what goes on in the commercial sector, you'd still save 60 billion over 5 years. So it does seem to me that the argument, well, you know, we're different, and you throw your hands up in the air, it's got some validity, but not total validity.
Yeah, very good.
One thought,
Sure,
data access and transparency. There is no entity in the world that has more data than the Department of Defense, but we keep it locked up in little stovepipes that individual components own. And so if you're looking at real property, for example, right now the department's trying to do a cost accounting exercise where they just are trying to understand how are we actually spending money on different properties. And if you do that, if you unlock that data and you apply analytics across it, the problem children pop out. And you see, well, in one case, you're paying 5 times more for electricity in the same region than another facility down the road. Why is that? Or you know, maintenance, or whatever the issue is. So I think there's a huge, it's very powerful if we could figure out a way to unlock and access and analyze the data that the department already has in stovepipes to get at some of these efficiencies.
That's very good. Dr. Hamre, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Well,
to that?
if I may, just, you know, we really have 2 different kinds of budgets in the Department of Defense. We've got budgets we manage from the top down, that's procurement, MILCON, military personnel, and then there are budgets that are bottom up, that's O&M. We do not manage that in any detail. The way we handle it is we dial out, we give cash at various levels to people. We give them a little bit less than they ask for, and we see how loud they scream. That's really how we manage O&M. I mean, we do not manage O&M in an effective way, and everybody knows they're sandbagging dollars at lower levels because they know they're going to get cut. So we really do have to find a different way we get at how to analyze and understand the O&M budget. And the O&M budget now is doing a lot of procurement. It's not just operations anymore. We're buying a lot of procurement through the O&M budget. So you're onto something very big here, but you're going to have to drill down to say, if we were to change the way we budget and manage the execution of O&M, how would we do that?
Very good. Thank you very much. And you're back.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate your having this hearing. It tells me how serious you are about this topic, and I know it's been going on for some time. One of the questions that really is looming out there right now, and you've talked so much about the people who are in important places, leadership, but I'm wondering right now, we have a federal hiring freeze. We're also having a great deal of difficulty getting people into appointed positions, nominations, and even the confirmations. How is that affecting all of this?
I think it is creating a very challenging environment. I think the hiring freeze in particular is sort of, you know, using a meat axe when you need a scalpel. And many administrations across, you know, political line of all different stripes have used this. It's a very blunt instrument because what it does is it cuts off your talent pipeline. And so it prohibits you from hiring the best talent coming in, the next generation, even in the most high priority areas. And so you basically create a personnel bathtub that will follow you through over time, you know, as your talent pool progresses. I was on the CIA advisory board, and we watched this bathtub that was created, I think it was in the Carter years, follow all the way through the workforce, where still in very senior grades today, you have a paucity of the right kind of expertise and personnel because of that hiring freeze decades ago. And so I think there are better ways to manage that personnel infrastructure. The other thing is, as you are right-sizing, reshaping the workforce and making cuts, it's very important to also be investing in the workforce and the talent that you want to keep, so that you're continuing professional development, you're continuing to groom and promote the high performers and so forth, because if you don't do that, you will actually break the workforce in the process of reshaping it, which is why that human capital strategy piece up front is so important, to pull all of the different pieces together.
So I'm wondering then, and certainly for this committee, you've had a lot of suggestions about how to try and get at some of these issues. Some of them are cultural. Others are just, I think, people just haven't tackled those issues. What is the best way of going about that? I know on personnel over the last few years, some changes were made. There were commissions that looked at some of those issues. Sometimes it feels as if that only creates a delay in getting things done. But if we had, this year, looking at what is it specifically that could be done to get at that. You mentioned one of the positions that I think someone who hasn't even taken that position yet, trying to get to. What would you do on a lot of these?
I think
do we need a task force here or internally for?
I think what this committee could do is ask the Secretary of Defense to create a human capital strategy for the civilian workforce of the department, and then he would task each of his line managers to do component strategies. I harp on this because, if I were going to answer that previous question about what was the most successful, powerful reform you witnessed when you were in government, it was implementing a human capital strategy in my own organization as we were having to downsize, because I knew that if you didn't complement the downsizing with investment and keeping the best talent and incentivizing the participation and the morale and people buying into, even though it was going to be a smaller organization, a still vigorous organization. To me, that's the key. You got to have a strategy of where you're trying to go that isn't just about cuts, but also reinvesting in what you're going to keep. And so that's where I would start, and I would encourage the Secretary to report to you on that and to hold all of his direct reports accountable for helping him develop that department-wide.
Dr. Zakheim?
Yeah, I would focus on two things. First, we've all talked about training and education, and I do believe that no one should enter the senior executive service and be a top manager without getting the kind of education the same way the military does, a year where you're really learning about either technology or human resource management. The other one is, if you're going to formulate any kind of requirement for a human resource management plan, like Michele just talked about, be careful not to create the kind of loopholes that DOD always blows right through. And I'll give you an example. The 2013 NDAA had called for an efficiencies plan, but allowed DOD to identify exemptions from the total workforce. Out of 776,000 people, 538,000 were exempted. If that's going to be the situation, you're not going to get anywhere. So I would strongly urge, if you follow Michele's advice, make it as tight as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Byrne?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Flournoy, you brought up a topic that's been sort of a hot topic around here, and some of us have been skeptics about it. I want to go back to it with you. That's BRAC. We've had discussions about BRAC ever since I've been on the committee, 3.5 years now. And some of us have tried to look into past BRACs to determine if those BRACs actually resulted in savings, real substantial savings. And we couldn't find any evidence that, in fact, there were those sorts of demonstrable savings that would make the BRAC effort worth it. So I'd like for you to disabuse me of my skepticism, tell me where I'm wrong and other members of the committee are wrong. Will BRAC, based upon past experience, will it really bring savings to us?
I am not an expert on this topic, but I believe the GAO has done a number of reports that, and the way my understanding of their conclusions was that the early rounds of BRAC actually did result in recurring savings over time. in the single-digit billions. And I could get the exact figure for you, but I'm sure your staff can get to that report, or I can provide it. The BRAC round that sort of poisoned the well was the last one, because it really was a realignment and consolidation BRAC. It really wasn't a closure BRAC by and large, and so it really didn't save a lot of money. And the way in which the process worked, I think, left a lot of a sour taste in the mouths of many people who participated. So I think there are certainly lessons to be learned in how to go about this to ensure that it is worth the pain associated with doing it. But I do think the early rounds of BRAC demonstrate that real savings can be had over time. And given the extent of the overhang, when you've got service chiefs saying, I have 20 to 25% more infrastructure than I need, and it's taking money away from readiness and investment in future capability for the people we're sending into harm's way, I think we have to wrestle with this.
Yeah, would either one of you gentlemen want to respond to that?
If I may, sir, the secret is that BRAC was the biggest MILCON program in history. We built stuff all over in the gaining bases and gave them modern new facilities. So you really have to look at this at BRAC as having made possible the real plant modernization for major elements of the department. It financed, I was just down in Huntsville last week. My gosh, the fabulous facilities down in Huntsville. It was all made possible by BRAC. So the reason that you don't see big savings is because, frankly, we spent it along the way to modernize. We would have had to have done something with modernization anyway. So I would look at this in a slightly different way. How do we find a way to internally finance the modernization of our forces, especially real property? I think we should look at BRAC in a slightly different way than just, are we going to rack up big savings that we can show to the American taxpayer?
Well, but that's the way it's typically been sold to us. You're going to save money. And when we look
Yes, sir,
at,
I understand.
And so I'm not saying that it's not appropriate to look at what you're saying we should look at, but the way we're being approached with it is, hey, we need to save this money. And we just are skeptics about that part of it. Maybe it's something worth doing beyond the fact that it saves money. Maybe it achieves some other things for us, but it seems to me we haven't had a good enough case made by the services that a BRAC would actually save money. I mean, do y'all have, Dov Zakheim, did you have something you want to add to that?
Well, I tend to agree with John Hamre on this. If you look at BRAC the way we've been talking about other efficiencies, with the idea is, there are two ways to benefit from efficiencies. One is to save the money and give it back to OMB. I wouldn't want to do that. I tried to avoid it when I was comptroller. The other way is to take the money, I think, as Michele pointed out, and said, yeah, we're going to put it back into service priorities. If you approach BRAC that way, we're going to take the money and put it back into service priorities, you're in a completely different place. But I totally agree with you that if the case is made on the basis of savings, the case is weak.
I think that's why you have the service chiefs pushing for this so strongly, because they want that money to reinvest elsewhere, whether it's in readiness or even more so in future capabilities that they know they're going to need to deal with more challenging adversaries.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I'd just say I would hope that if we could get that information from the service chiefs, what is it that you would do with this money that you think you're going to save, and how is you think that that's going to make your operation more efficient, more effective? That would be helpful to me to be able to take a closer look at the BRACs and see if they really make sense. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'll just mention, we asked the services a couple years ago to give us some data to support the idea that they have 20% excess infrastructure. What we got back basically was the 2004 estimate, and nothing really updated since then. So I think the attitude a lot of us have is we want to work with you to save money, but we're going to have something more than something that goes back more than a decade before the last round of BRAC upon which to base a decision. I appreciate the gentleman raising the issue. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question pertains to changes in acquisition. I know that, Dr. Hamre, you had identified some specific things that perhaps we should consider undoing from previous years. But I also know that Ms. Flournoy, in your submitted testimony, and I missed some of your responses to questions as I had to step out. I apologize. You advocate for a pause, perhaps a year-long pause in further acquisition reform to allow the Department of Defense to realize and measure the impact of changes made in the last few NDAAs. I wanted you to elaborate on that, and let me throw out all my questions so this way each of you can respond, perhaps. Dr. Zakheim, you had mentioned the workforce training for acquisition. I know in October of 2002, the Army stood up the Acquisition Corps to identify, recruit, retain, develop that civilian and military workforce. Is that working? Is it a good model? Should it go service-wide, department-wide? Thank you.
Let me clarify. I don't mean a full-stop pause. What I was trying to say is last year's authorization bill gave the Secretary and the Department a lot of guidance on how to change the acquisition system, and particularly how the Department, the organizational structure. You know, dividing the Undersecretary into two, creating new authorities, staff, procedures, et cetera. There's just having lived through many organizational changes in the department, I think that I would say that the focus, as Dr. Hamre said, this year should be on really working very, very closely with the department to make sure those changes are perhaps tweaked and refined a little bit as needed, but also fully implemented as intended before you sort of take your eye off that ball and go on to the next round, particularly of any further organizational changes. So it's not really a pause, but I think you've put a lot on the plate in terms of acquisition reform, and I think I would say it's a good time to switch to some other areas while really monitoring closely the implementation of what you've already asked the department to do in that regard.
Well, I differ somewhat with my colleague and friend, Michele Flournoy. I personally believe that you got to go full bore, because if you give the bureaucracy time to figure out what you've asked for, they'll also figure out a way to get around what you asked for. Happens over and over again. You got to keep pushing, in my view. On your question about training, remember when the Army brought this in, they had a string of disasters, of acquisition disasters. They've done better, although find me a good new light helicopter. They're still working on that. But again, the focus was on training, and there has to be training. But there also needs to be a focus on education. You don't keep up with Moore's Law through a training course at DAU. You just don't. A year at MIT might do it, though. And so you need both, and it should be obviously defense-wide, because even if a service has a pretty efficient way of getting its systems through its own process. Look at Stackley at the Navy, who's really a terrific assistant secretary and has worked, I think, for both Democrats and Republicans. They don't want to let him go. But what happens when whatever has passed through him now hits OSD? You run into a roadblock again. So any reform that you think about implementing needs to be DOD-wide, in my view.
Just a follow-up, and Maryland's gained a lot in BRAC 2005 on a per capita basis, big plus-ups there. I'm hearing sort of conflicting views from the services as I speak with different service personnel leadership as to Navy, Army, and Air Force, who's in for BRAC, who's not, and what's the, can you just characterize perhaps it by service where they are?
Have the fidelity to give you an accurate answer. I'm sorry.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Ms. Flournoy, I'd like to begin with this. You know, we hear today about all the strategic challenges we have, our adversaries, whether it's terrorism and the groups associated with that, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. And since World War II, every administration has gone through the process of acquisition reform. But I argue today for the United States, with where we are, that our adversary, our challenge, that is as strategically important as the other adversaries we talk about all the time, are time and resources, of which we have excess of neither. Give me your perspective on how do we get an acquisition process that treats the adversaries of time and resources at the same level as it treats our adversaries of extremist groups, of Russia, of China, of Iran, in North Korea?
It's a great question, and I think it is what should be the driver behind really building out not just this new undersecretary, but a whole end-to-end system of how you go from, how you really create a pipeline for rapid acquisition and rapid access to commercial and technologies and integration of those technologies. Because I share your view, and I think this is a common assumption that, what we do in the next decade will determine whether we keep our military technological edge. It is under challenge in many domains: cyberspace, maritime, electronic. I mean, you can go down a list. If we stand still and rest on our laurels, we will not have the edge in 10 years' time. And in many of these areas, it's not going to be the new acquisition platform build that's going to yield fruit in 20 years. It's going to be how rapidly can we upgrade and modify and improve what we have. And so the efforts of DIUX, the efforts of the Strategic Capabilities Office that's currently that's housed in DARPA, but an independent organization, the efforts of DARPA, these are, and how quickly we can prototype and get those into the field, that is what is going to determine whether we can prevail in the future. So I think we can't have a great enough sense of urgency here. And I think building out the bypass system is the most immediate goal. And then I'd love to keep reforming the main system, but the urgency is building out the bypass and making it a super highway instead of a one-lane dirt road.
Dr. Zakheim, let me ask you, in addition to this question, let me ask you to expand, because where I see the United States today in relation to our adversaries is this. When our adversaries look to start a new system, whether it's a combat system, whether it's a new class of ships or aircraft, they start with a blank piece of paper. And they go through and they put their ideas on there and they go, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and they problem solve and get to decision making quickly through that realm. When we start here in the United States, we have a sheet of paper that's filled with no's. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do this. So we look for portholes through that whole sheet of paper with no's. How do we pull out our eraser and take those no's off the page so we can start with the blank sheet of paper, which is where our adversaries start, and they add to that blank sheet of paper by stealing some things too so they can bypass us even more quickly? Give me your perspective on how we get there.
Well, again, I think the key is to open the door as wide as possible to commercial acquisition. If you buy into the notion that the big weapon systems are essentially platforms for things you put in them, then the question becomes, how do I get the things that I want to put in them as quickly as possible and as advanced as possible? Look, if you go out to Silicon Valley, they're ahead of time. You go to the Defense Department, we're behind time. And so that's the key. How wide can you force that door open? And unless there's legislation to force it open, it ain't going to open, because the culture of the department is anti-profit, anti-commercialization, lots and lots of inboxes and outboxes, and you know all the rest. By the way, I heard something really interesting which shows even the bad guys steal from each other. Russians came to China and discovered that the Chinese had stolen their plans for the latest airplane, and they discovered it was exactly the same. So if they're stealing from each other, you can imagine how much they're stealing from us. We have to focus on that as well, and we're doing a lot in that regard. But unless we go after the things that everybody else wants to steal, then we're not going to make that 10-year gap that Michele talked about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Would you permit me to, you didn't ask me the question, but may I just offer something?
Please, yes.
I go back to when I was nominated to be the comptroller, Senator John Glenn asked me to come up to sit in on a hearing he was holding in Government Affairs Committee about how bad the finance and accounting system was in the Department of Defense. That had a searing impact on me, and I probably spent 20% of my time when I was the comptroller trying to go after that problem. I would suggest, again, I mentioned you were out at the, because you had another obligation, but I would recommend you bring in the new Deputy Secretary of Defense. He's an acquisition professional. He's been working inside industry, and you tell him you want him to give you a plan in 6 months on how he's going to streamline the system. Now, it isn't going to give you all the answers, but I promise you he's going to spend a third of his time working on that problem. And it's about leadership. That's what the real key is. I apologize for interrupting.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
No, that's great. Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to see Ms. Flournoy again. I have a question, and I was following off with Congressman Whitman's ideas. I am a fan of DARPA. I think DARPA is amazing. It's been explained to me once, like he said, imagine about 100 or so geniuses just doing whatever they do, and just one, like a travel agent, making sure that they're staying in their right places. And as we all know, when Prime Minister Abe was looking at trying to reform the Japanese military, the one thing he wanted that we had was like a DARPA, because it just work so well. Having said that, however, and this is in line with what Michele Flournoy was saying, as well as you, Dr. Zakheim, it's this idea of the reality is we can have this thing about silos and what we need to do, but the reality is we are here every 2 years. You know, it depends. The president is there every 4. It takes him a while to maybe pick whoever's going to be in the respective positions, and therefore the concepts of what we should do to modify how we do things can come and go very quickly. So how do you anticipate, like if it seems to me like getting rid of the silos is a great idea, something that should have been done a long time ago, but hasn't. But then the question becomes, okay, it seems like some other kind of bureaucracy is going to have to take over to do away with the silos. And like Ms. Flournoy was saying with BRAC, there's going to be an expense that may make it seem inefficient before you have the benefit. So as you all sit there, tell me, given the political reality of how Congress and how administration operates, how are we going to be able to accomplish this if you have a totally changed philosophy in 2 years or 4 years? And what I really want to make sure of is that we don't do things to entities like DARPA that works. And those are my concerns. I agree, we need to do something. But how do you do it in the political reality of what we deal with?
Let me take a stab at that. I'm a Republican. My 2 colleagues are Democrats. We're pretty much in agreement on a lot of this, and this is a very bipartisan committee. The point is, when it comes to efficiencies and defense reform, it's not a political issue in the sense that many other things are. So that's already an advantage in your favor. The second thing is, this is one of the reasons why I would argue push for reforms as quickly as you can, precisely because it's a 2-year turnover. And also, once the legislation is there, the department always adapts if you don't give them the flexibility to wiggle out of it. So that's the second thing. The third thing is, Congress can, and I think John Hamre alluded to this several times, Congress can call the leadership of the department in and say, okay, what have you done? What have you accomplished? Because what you want is consistency. I wouldn't get rid of a DIUX just because Ash Carter brought it in. That's ridiculous. And what I've seen over the years is you get new secretaries, new undersecretaries, they come in and they reinvent the wheel. They have a 100-day plan and they basically say the guy before me was an idiot, which if you think about it means that everybody was an idiot because the new guy said that about the old guy. You've got to get away from that. The way you get away from that is Congress keeps pushing and saying, we've legislated X, demonstrate how you've effectively made X to work. That you can do, and you can do it over time.
And as Ms. Flournoy answers, but you know, everyone knows this, Ms. Flournoy. You've talked about it for years and years, but we don't do it. So go ahead.
And I think one of the challenges, we too often focus, in my view, on moving the organizational boxes without changing the underlying incentives that drive behavior. And I'll give you a great example that John Hamre gets lots of credit for because he worked on it when he was up on the Hill, of legislating a change of incentive that we are still feeling the effects of today. Goldwater Nichols. You went from, it used to be that joint service was the death of a military career. You're out of sight, out of mind, forget promotion if you leave your service. Once you passed Goldwater Nichols and you said you may not become a general or flag officer unless you A, get joint education, and B, you have joint experience. It completely flipped the incentive, and now all of the hard chargers are looking for that joint experience and looking for that joint education, and how am I going to be that so I can get the stars on my shoulder? It's very powerful, and over a generation or two, that's the bedrock of joint culture. It's all that time being educated together, serving together. So I think the thing we have to wrestle with is what are the incentive changes that you all could legislate that would create fundamentally different behavior in the acquisition and innovation domain? To me, that's going to be more powerful and enduring than any tweaks we make to the organizational chart. Now you're going to ask me what that is. I think
I'm out of time.
But do you mind if I may just...
You'd have to ask the chair.
There are 5 reasons why DARPA has been a huge success. First, the chairman serves a 5-year term, the director. And so it's a long enough period of time for you to be accountable, and you want to show results. That's the first thing. Second thing is there's an astounding amount of financial flexibility for DARPA. There are only 4 line items in DARPA's account, and they can move money across any of them. Congress has tied the department's hands. You cannot move more than $4 million from one line item to another in R&D without coming back for permission. DARPA has total flexibility to do that. That's the second. The third reason is almost all of their work is placed entirely in the private sector. And they can do rapid acquisition by going out to the private sector. They have special authorities to do that, but they place it in the private sector. The fourth reason is program managers are not allowed to stay more than 4 years. So they don't build up entrenched bureaucracies around themselves. It's a fairly small, fairly lean organization, and they can only stay for 4 years. And the last thing is they get Secretary of Defense protection. Now, you put those 5 factors together, that's why we have success. I would have to tell you, and I say this respectfully, we're doing just the reverse with our legislation. We're creating more overhead, more fracturing of it. We're putting more restrictions on where you can put money and how you spend it. I mean, please step back to look at how you could take that model and bring more flexibility to the department, because that's why DARPA works.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize, it went over.
No, we're a little more flexible today with these witnesses. General Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as someone who served nearly 30 years in the Air Force, I tell you, your stellar reputations precede you, so thank you for being here. 2 quick comments and then a couple of questions. I was part of the rapid acquisition as an operator within the Air Force, the Big Safari. Really works. One thing it doesn't work is the manning of those weapon systems once we produce them. We typically only man them at 50%, even though we've done a good job fielding them. So I hope we have to match the rapid acquisition with other things that the service provides there, I think, for it to be effective. I'm thinking of the MC-12 as an example, 50% manned while we had it in the Air Force and put a lot of risk into the system. Just one example. Secondly, I'm very proud that this committee has worked on reducing the size or the number of general officers and SESs, particularly in the Pentagon. It's been my experience we've been overstaffed there. Now for a couple questions. Have we reduced the OSD staff at the same levels that we have with the services? Because I think we need to. It's just my impression, but I'd love to have your thoughts on that, and whoever would like to answer.
Go first.
Put you up first.
My impression is we have not, and in fact, each time you add an assistant secretary or you have a congressionally mandated deputy undersecretary, somebody who needs confirmation, you have created an excuse to hire more and more staff. In my written testimony, you'll see I give a few examples of where, in fact, you can combine assistant secretaries so that you can cut back on the staff. I think you should cut back on principal deputies. I don't think you need them. And finally, when we talk about splitting the undersecretary for AT&L, make sure that the total number of OSD staff working for the two is no greater than working for the one, which was too big to begin with. If you look back at the growth of the AT&L bureaucracy over the last 20 years, it skyrockets.
Should the Armed Services Committees of both the Senate and the House drive this, or does the Secretary of Defense, should he take ownership of doing what you're saying?
I would say that this is something that requires consultation with the Secretary, and if the Secretary is forthcoming, and this particular Secretary is very forthcoming about just about everything, I would say that it may well be that the Secretary could handle it. The only downside to that is what happens when a new Secretary comes in.
Right.
That's my concern.
Anyone else care to answer?
And I think you should put the onus on, on the Secretary of Defense to come back to you with what is the optimal mix, where's the optimal allocation. And there may be areas where he needs to grow capability, and there may be areas where he can reduce the capability, but giving him the flexibility to move to, consolidate organizations, eliminate low priority functions, reassign staff. I mean, those kinds of authorities and flexibilities are key to doing that reshaping, because again, there may be some cutting, but there's also going to need to be some reinvestment in the human capital.
Well, sure fits in with my perception that we need to reduce the size of the OSD team. Another question for you, use it or lose it at the end of the year. How do we reform that better? Because we get a lot of new desks, a lot of new paintings, a lot of new rugs, and it's wasteful. End of year spending, use it or lose it. Anybody, any thoughts on that?
I remember I was a comptroller, and I remember we had a process where we would move money from time zone to time zone the last day to be able to spend.
I see it a lot too.
Okay, so yeah, we're. Part of it is you've done some of that. I don't know if the authority is still in place, but funds that are not spent in the O&M account by the end of the fiscal year, normally they lapse, but they're allowed to go into the foreign currency fluctuation fund. So it provides, and you don't have the incentive just to spend it on anything, because you can put it into something that you need. I think that's how you ought to think about this. I think you ought to find a way where you can take the the funds that are otherwise close to expiring and give them an opportunity to live in a different way for something that the department needs. In this case, foreign currency fluctuation was a big deal, in the 1990s. I don't know if it's as much a problem today as it was back then, but I think it's something like that. The other thing is, frankly, O&M it's managed on a decentralized basis. We don't really know how it's being spent in the field. And until we start developing different approaches, here probably the committee should find out how big corporations manage O&M. They must have a different way of doing it than we do in the government. But like I said, we don't know.
Work on profit.
Yeah, they have an incentive for it. So.
Right. Thank you very much. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, may I just add a couple things? I agree with John the way, by the way, that private corporations do it is they're monitoring the funds on a daily basis. And one thing that I tried to do, I brought in the E to PPBE, which is execution, and I wanted to have an execution review every quarter, which is nothing compared to daily reviews of where the monies are. But if you have an execution review every quarter as opposed to one mid-year review, then the comptroller is in a better position, working with the joint staff in particular, to move those monies around and minimize that last-minute spending that you're talking about. Moving monies into an account that would allow them to be used for other purposes, well, some people are going to turn around and say it's a slush fund. So you got to be very careful about what accounts you're talking about. But it seems to me that the more visibility you have into what are called bishops' funds, and it's actually a total church hierarchy, because the further down you go, the Monsignor's got his money, and so on and so forth. The more transparency you get, and we've all talked about that, the more likely it is you're going to prevent what you're talking about.
Well, thank you again, and I just submit, Mr. Chairman, that use it or lose it reforms is something we should be looking at. I think it's an embarrassment. Thank you.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm hopeful that if there is a supplemental that we enact, that it can be spent beyond September 30th, at least for that money for this year. We've done it a few times before to extend beyond the fiscal year, and it seems to me, getting at the problem you're talking about, that it would make some sense. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you all for being here. Research and development is critical, and that's part of having the best weapons platforms and innovations for the future. But sometimes research dollars are vulnerable because in the beginning stages of researching new technologies, it's not yet tied to a program. So how can research dollars in these times of constrained budgets be protected so that we still have the great capabilities that our finest minds in the world are able to come up with and stay ahead of any potential adversaries, but those dollars might be taken for something else if we're not careful?
Well, this is a big problem because you know, when we were back in the days when we had R&D budgets that were about half the size of the procurement budget, we couldn't possibly turn the breakthroughs into weapon systems. We didn't have enough procurement money. You know, and so part of the reason that it was scaled back, you know, the last couple of years as a percentage was because there just was not sufficient capacity to take advantage of what we were inventing. So I think the whole fresh look at R&D would be very helpful. It's one of the things that would be very good for this new Undersecretary for Research and Engineering to do. I mean, because the current DDR&E largely just looks after the 6.1 and 6.2 account. You know, they don't have a capacity to look at the whole, and I think that would be a good thing for you to ask the next Undersecretary to do. Corporations will have, I was with one for a time, I was on the board of one for a time that had something called a vitality index, which is how much of our R&D that we spend today shows up on the shelf as a product we sell within 5 years. And there were objective measures that they had as a company to say, where are we willing to spend money because we want to see a return on it. Now, it's hard for us to do that in the Defense Department, but we should have some kind of a mechanism where we're looking at the R&D program and say, where does this fit in? You know, where does it fit in and what difference will it make? And you're hard-pressed to find that. So there's some real management we need to bring to this problem.
You know, all companies basically look at capital expenditures, which includes R&D expenditures, and the CEO has to report back to the board and say, here's what I think is going to come of this, precisely because they're bottom line operations. One possibility that might help deal with the concern you raise is if this new undersecretary really is committed to having a partnership with the commercial sector, with the non-defense commercial sector, so that our bureaucrats, and again, I mean, you want to talk about measures of merit and changing culture. I've said in my testimony, don't let anybody become a senior executive servant unless they've spent a year at MIT or Caltech or what have you, if they want to be in the acquisition corps, because it's going to make a difference. I've also suggested that there is a program called the Secretary of Defense Corporate Fellows, where they send about 18 or 20 people to corporations. Triple that, and then have an equal number of civilians there, so they know what it's like in industry. The more you cross-pollinate with industry, the more they'll think about, yeah, where do my R&D dollars lead to? What will I really get? Because now they'll be thinking in terms of CapEx, if I can use the term that everybody uses. I think that might be a way to help out.
Michele, do you have any thoughts to add?
One thing I would say is that if you're going to move towards a system that puts more emphasis on experimentation, innovation, prototyping, you know, you have to have a somewhat higher tolerance for failure, that there are going to be certain things that you prototype, they don't work out, but you learn from the experience, and that makes the next thing better. So I actually think in the model that you're trying to create with this new organization, you want to have a higher proportion of R&D spending relative to what we've had vis-a-vis procurement, and that you don't want to have such an emphasis on ultimate ROI that you miss the learning curve that you get out of a very robust experimentation and prototyping plan.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Very quickly, Iron Dome in Israel, that was done in 3 years, from pad of paper to operation. And I just can't see that kind of result here in the U.S., and yet there's times we're going to need that kind of quick turnaround.
I think that's a great example of urgent operational need. You had civilians in Israel being killed by rockets from Gaza. They went out and saw what is possible today. What can we put together that works? And they went out and procured it and fielded it as fast as possible with our help. I think this gets to one of the things that I hope will be on your plate is the whole military requirement setting process, that sometimes that is obstacle to doing things quickly. We spend so much time trying to get consensus, and we over-specify the requirements that, we spend so much time, we spend years on that up front, that we're already behind the curve when we finally get to trying to actually acquire the thing. So figuring out where do you really need to have the military specs, and where can you rely on commercial and integration and adaptation kind of I think that's a key distinction that we need to work on.
Well, the Israeli system, by the way, is so different from ours in another respect. They are totally integrated, the commercial side and the Ministry of Defense, so that when they go out and say, yes, we need X, the commercial folks are on it quickly. And we have this gap, because for too many of our people in the acquisition system, the commercial side's the enemy. We've got to break down that barrier.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield back.
Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that people have varying opinions on how how Congress should go about tackling these issues. And other than legislation, I was wondering, what do you think Congress can do or refrain from doing that could improve the efficiency or the effectiveness of the acquisition process?
Well, I would go back to what I mentioned about DARPA. I think that DARPA is such a success because it has so much flexibility but accountability. The director is there for 5 years. That individual is totally accountable for what comes out of that product. Out of their budget every year. They have a lot of flexibility in the budget. They have they're not bound by the civil service system for finding program managers. So it's a very different model. It's a model where it's more about leadership and trusting leadership, and less about arcane and very rigid rules. And I think, honestly, we're on a path where we're writing legislation so much just dictating how the department has to do things, that we're undermining what I think is really the key, which is hold them accountable, give them the flexibility, and use the other power that you guys have, which you don't use enough of, which is to bring them up and talk to them. I mean, you have no idea how frightening it is when they get a call and say, the committee wants to hear, it's not going to be a hearing, we're just going to have a private meeting. That has enormous impact. But right now, most people think they just have to write big bills to have impact with the department. You don't. There's so much more you could do by utilizing this power that you have from this position. So I would do less, create more accountability. Think about a model where you're trying to recruit the very best people that want to come in and serve because they have a lot of authority to get things done, and you're trying to help them do it.
John Hamre was my predecessor, actually, but one as comptroller, and I can say as comptroller as well, the congressional restrictions on moving money from one account to another are just too tight. John mentioned the director of DARPA doesn't have to worry about that to any degree that just about anybody else does. And when we're talking about a budget of approximately $600 billion, and then you're told we must go to 4 committees to move $25 million from one account to another, I mean, that's ridiculous. Certainly not how industry works. Certainly not how any successful company would work. So it seems to me that I fully understand why Congress wants to watch how monies move, but there's a long way between 20 or 25 million and a $600 billion budget. And it seems to me raising those ceilings would be one way to create the ability to be flexible and agile. And then if you combine it with some of the other reforms that this committee is pushing, then you're going to start to see a real synergy.
I would just add that same flexibility in moving and managing people is really, really key. And then the last thing I would say is, there have been lots of reform attempts over the year, and when something doesn't work, rather than removing it, we just add another layer. And so I think clearing away some of the layered complexity of past reform and regulatory efforts that haven't necessarily yielded the desired results, but people still feel accountable to go by, that can also add a lot of needed flexibility.
And so with all of that, what do you think is the most appropriate mix and the most cost-effective mix that the military should try to achieve as it relates to military, civilian, and contractor personnel to accomplish its mission?
Again, I think that will be, the answer to that question requires a comprehensive assessment that I don't think has been done in a long time. But I think the general assumption that I've heard this morning is, there's likely to be some reshaping of the civilian career workforce while investing in that workforce's development and education and training, and probably a reduction in the level of contractors that we rely on to support those civilian functions.
And we also have to look very closely at what we want the military to do as opposed to what someone else can do. And that's important as well. So it's not just a matter of cutting this level or that level of civilians or cutting contractors. It's also a matter of who's doing what. And so it really has to be a comprehensive view.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And if I may add, it has to be a comprehensive review where we have the honest price of each of the forms of labor. We do not have a uniform way in which we put the full costs of having a uniform or a civilian or a contractor side by side to say which is the most cost-effective way to do this job. So you could demand, again, this is a plea, you could demand that the Congress give you, or that the department develop a real objective cost assessment that you can see the difference between military labor, civilian labor, contracted labor.
Ms. Flournoy, as y'all were talking about it earlier, I had in my mind that you were talking about, say, a human capital plan for OSD. But you're really talking about something broader than that when you start bringing in who does what. What do contractors do? What do civilians do? What do military people do? Am I right? Or I'm trying to think, okay, how do we write this? What's the charge here?
I think that, ideally you would want a full assessment department-wide, but that's a pretty Herculean task. So I think where I would start is with the Secretary's own staff and to ask him to lay out for the functions of OSD, what is the right mix of military, civilian, and contractor, and how does he need to reshape and re-educate, train, develop his workforce to be as effective and efficient as possible. But I think you could then look at other components beyond OSD, and should, because from a resources perspective, the OSD is dwarfed by the staffs of the services, the staffs of the defense agencies, and so forth. But if you're looking for a way to pilot the approach and get your arms around a piece of the puzzle and then learn from that experience to then go after other pieces, it's not a bad place to start.
I would agree with that, except I would expand it to include the joint staff. There's a lot of overlap there. There are some people who say we just ought to combine them the way the Canadians or the Brits do. I'm not sure that's the right way to go. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not the right way to go. But still, there is an awful lot of overlap, and I think looking at them together as a unit might be one way to deal with this pilot project, as Michele puts it. The other thing is, I wouldn't allow this to stand in the way of mandating reductions in the civilian workforce. The civilian workforce is just too big, and I haven't seen any efficiency out of it. There's no correlation between the growth of the workforce and its efficiency. In fact, it's a negative correlation.
Well, that really gets to the second part, or the other question I wanted to ask. There are some suggestions that we ought to give the Secretary of Defense authority to reorganize, say, OSD, however he wanted to, in 6 months' time. But is your view that we ought to expect this human capital report before there is authority to move the boxes around and have buyouts and so forth?
I think that ultimately you want the review, first of all, you want form to fit function. You want the focus to be first on, you know, what are the important functions where I need, you know, potentially more investment, where am I willing to take some risk and do less? And then you need to adapt, I think, add on the human capital layer to fill out how are we going to actually staff that. So one of the things that when I had my little world of policy, which was by then 1,000 people, it had grown a lot since I'd first been in there in the Clinton administration. We did them simultaneously, and one of the things we asked is, if you had 10% more to invest, where would you invest it? If you had to cut 10%, where would you cut? And we did that at a very low level all the way through the organization. And it gave you a pretty good sense of where we were short and we really needed to plus up, and where people really thought, I'm doing this because I'm told I have to do it, but I really don't think there's much value here. And so we sort of did the two streams in a complementary way or overlapping way. I don't think they have to be strictly sequenced.
Sir, I just think you're going to have to impose cuts and then tell them, figure out what's the most efficient way to do what you got to do. And if there are things that you don't need to do or you think are low value, tell us what that is. But I'm close enough to a number of corporations. When they have to do a downsizing, they don't start with a bottom-up review. They start with a top-down goal. And I think Bill Perry used to say, reform does not, I can't remember what he said now, forgive me, but you have to make cuts first and commit yourself to those cuts before you can figure out how you're going to get the best value out of it. I just honestly think I've been around it too much. You're going to get very incremental, marginal suggestions if you do it on a bottom-up basis.
Let me clarify, I agree with that. I think you have to have a target, but then allow a combination of a functional review and the human capital review in terms of figuring out how you're going to get there. But the target is key to incentivizing the result.
And that's where I would come out as well. If you don't give them some clear directive as to how much they should cut over what period of time, they're not going to do it. First of all, they're going to try to wait you out. That's number one. Number two is they're going to try to, like I had mentioned somewhat earlier, they'll try, if you give them any sort of vehicle for exemption, they'll exempt as many people as they could. 500,000 out of 700,000. I mean, that sort of thing. So it's got to be tightly written. It's got to be clearly directed, and then you give the secretary, and I would argue the secretary together with the chairman, because I think it is important if you're focusing on OSD, the OSD and the joint staff I really think need to be looked at together. Have them both, give them the flexibility within that overall number, and then have them come back and report to you, and not a written report, because the written reports can be written by a contractor, but have them actually come and testify in front of you.
But I think a cost-saving target, that gives them maximum flexibility of how to get there. And this is where the other authorities come in, are so important. As you gave last year, a RIF authority that's not just about seniority, but actually about performance. VSIP authority, you raise the level, which is great, but still supervisors can't use that on an individual basis to actually incentivize individuals who need to depart to depart. So, I mean, I think those accompanying authorities are really, really important to turn the, to really give the flexibility required to reshape the organization in a productive manner.
The only thing that worries me about authorities, Mr. Chairman, is that bureaucrats will say, okay, I've got the authority, I don't want to use it. And what'll then happen is the deadwood always stays, which is why deadwood bureaucrats love hiring freezes. Because who goes? The junior people. They don't come in. The ones who come in last, they're the ones who go out. That's just not the way to get the department up to speed with all our enemies out there.
Okay. If y'all indulge me just a few moments more, Dr. Hamre, I got to go back to the beginning and this undersecretary business. I understand your point that you dilute the effectiveness of the one by having the second, and you address this in your written testimony, but I still need to hear it again. So if you have the Undersecretary for Research and Development, but then you give under him the acquisition authority, how is that not recreating AT&L under a different name?
Yes, sir. I think the most important thing we're trying to do is to change AT&L from a giant compliance organization into an innovation organization. You're not going to get that done unless you break it up. And I think breaking it up means you take those mechanical functions of acquisition, procurement policy, FAR review, all that kind of stuff. You put that under an assistant secretary. That's what the assistant secretary does. The undersecretary is responsible for all the big choices that the department's going to make that involves acquisition, development, and purchase of things. But you have to make that job big enough so that you're going to recruit somebody really big who will want that job, because it really is meaningful. All of the acquisition, we took a big step, you took a big step 2 years ago when you pushed a lot of the acquisition back to the services, a very good thing to do. So we need to get the bulk of the acquisition process back to the services, get a smaller organization at the top that's overseeing the process that the services implement, and then a powerful person who makes big choices for the department. And I think having two undersecretaries, I think, could confuse that. So it's really disassembling what we built up with the Packard Commission and going back to having the services play much more of a role and OSD playing much more of an oversight role, with a creative person being a decider about big choices.
But the assistant secretary reports to the undersecretary.
Yes, sir.
So it's still within
It's still within that orbit. Still within that orbit. You have one acquisition secretary, but you're taking all of those mechanical functions and you're taking them down a level and you're pushing them out to the services.
Okay. Okay. Do y'all have anything more on that? Okay. Ms. Langevin, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one additional question that I had, and we had a discussion just a minute ago about cost-cutting targets. Last winter, we learned of a report out of the DoD that stated that $125 billion could be saved over the course of 5 years by tending to waste within the department. So this accounts for about 4% of DoD outlays and is well within the types of savings that companies also try to achieve through cost-cutting practices. And while I'm disappointed this report was initially buried within the department, I think there are certainly valuable lessons that can be learned from it. How do you believe we can best meet these cost-saving objectives, and how have you seen the department implement some of the more actionable efficiencies?
Well, the report came out of the Defense Business Board, as you know, Ms. Langevin, and it wasn't really buried at all. I mean, it was easily accessible on the web. It was publicly briefed. We all talked about it. Nobody was told you couldn't talk about it. So I don't know where that whole thing came from, quite frankly. But to the substance of your concern, it does seem to me that what that report essentially is saying is, in the first place, your best start is with civilian personnel. And it seems to me that that's one where their legislation in terms of levels of civilian personnel might be very much worthwhile. That I believe that if you take their numbers from 2 years ago and update the numbers to fiscal 17 numbers, you save $5 to $8 billion. Not trivial, not a lot, but not trivial. Then they have 5 other categories, and in fact, Secretary of Defense listed those very same categories in his memorandum on efficiency. And so, again, picking up on what John Hamre said, get them in here. Ask them, okay, what have you done on each of these categories? And to the extent that you don't get a straight answer, you start thinking about legislation for it.
Just to add, I also think you need to think about how the Deputy Secretary and the CMO, what kind of capacity they will have to do this kind of management transformation work. You know, your typical political appointee is not going to necessarily have that kind of background and experience. And so a senior official who wants to take a transformation step is either they have to go hire a very expensive outside consultant, or they decide, they just don't have the bandwidth to take something on. One of the things that was included in the last authorization bill was authorization for what is called a delivery unit, which is actually taking a page from the UK, who basically brought, 30, 40 people with deep experience transforming organizations, coupled with some real experienced folks from within the department, and basically created an internal resource for the deputy and the CMO to work with the line managers of the organization on transformation plans and to really drive that change internally. But I do think you have to think about where are these 2 critical officials actually going to get the capacity, the kind of change that you're talking about, and to really drive that.
I personally think you could save $115 billion, but it's very hard choices, really tough choices we have to make. I think the average server in a computer center in the department runs about 10% of capacity. Because each of the services is buying their own stuff. I mean, but that means you're going in and you're ripping it out of a service. That's painful. It's hard to do that. We do not take advantage of the pricing power we have as the biggest renter of property in the United States, because it's fractured. It's all over the place. We don't have a central place where we're good at that. We spend money getting rid of things rather than making money getting rid of things. We've got 500 people at the disposal center. We're paying for them to get rid of stuff. We're not making any money off of it. I mean, look, but these are very hard things to do. They involve people's jobs in very specific locations. It involves a lot of freeing up a lot of restrictions that have been put on the department in recent years. So can we do it? Yeah, I think we can do it. They're very painful. And does that avoid us needing to increase money for the department because of the problems we've got now? No, I think we've got real readiness issues in the department, real readiness issues. We got a lot of airplanes that are really old, that we need to replace. I mean, so we need to be objective about it. I strongly think we should try to save the 115, 125, whatever billion that is, especially because it would give credibility to the department when it asks for additional resources.
Mm-hmm. One other area related to this is the whole area of contract auditing, which is highly controversial right now. But the fact of the matter is DCAA is billions of dollars behind. That's hurting industry in another way, which is they have to reserve money that they can't spend because they don't know if they're going to have to give it to DCAA. But leave that aside. The fact is, if you get a good outside auditor, they will start to tell you where some of this money that John Hamre just referred to is or isn't. And that gives you the vehicle to start moving monies around, to being more efficient, and, in fact, to reaching that $125 billion goal.
Sure. Well, certainly, I know that we're moving in the direction of being able to audit the department. I know we're trying to get to that point, and certainly this is another area where data analytics will come into play and help us to get where we want to be. So thank you all for your testimony, and with that, I'll yield back.
Yeah, I want to just emphasize on the Defense Business Board issue, not only did we not bury it, we cited it in our committee report 2 months later. And the increase in incentives to voluntarily leave the department that we had in last year's bill was one of the specific recommendations that they made. Now, the bigger dollar savings comes from the sort of civilian personnel reform that we've been talking about, which is part of the reason I have asked y'all several questions about that. As Dr. Zakheim mentioned, there was an effort that didn't go so well to do that a few years ago, but yet it's a significant area that needs our attention. Y'all have been very helpful. I've got lots of notes, but I also know where to find you to elicit more information and more questions. So thank you all for being here and for all that you assist this committee with. The hearing stands adjourned.